Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about the stress recovery adaptation cycle and how it applies to natural lifters and where it can get more complicated as you get more advanced. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And this is one of the reasons we're going to talk about training frequency from a different perspective, a different angle. A lot of times we'll talk about the muscle protein synthesis and why higher frequency works. It's even the stuff I've covered with Dr. Brad, which you guys saw just the other day, of what he noticed that even when volume is equal, training a muscle at least twice a week tends to give better overall gains, even though we know that growth stimulus is a product of total training workload, right? So your total training volume, which for a given exercise, assuming range of motion is the same, is like sets times reps times weight, right? Your tonnage moved. One of the biggest factors in terms of how much muscle growth you stimulate. But when it's divided up into at least, say, 2 sessions per week, like let's say your squats, let's say you're doing 12 sets of total squats a week, you tend to gain slightly more muscle if you do 2 days with 6 sets of squats instead of 1 day with 12, even if the weight moved is the same. And a lot of that has to do with not just the muscle protein synthesis uptime, but it has to do with the stress-recovery-adaptation cycle. So this should make sense. This is how everything works in your body, including even getting a tan, right? You have a stress, right? A stress. In this case, it could be sunlight. It could be a bicep curl, right? You're putting stress on your body. Stress that your body may not be able to handle completely. Because in other words, I mean, sunlight, if you have no exposure to sunlight or you're exposed to more sunlight than you're used to, that is a stressor on your body. That's a new stimulus that creates stress. It can cause at least small amounts of damage to tissue in your body. Same thing with training, right? You are causing damage to tissue in your body if it's a novel stress, if it's more than it's used to. In other words, if you can curl 100 pounds for 10 reps, doing 50 pounds for 5 isn't probably causing any problems. But when we start approaching our limitations, it does become a problem. So you have this stress, and then you have to recover from it, which oftentimes involves partial tissue remodeling, and then you adapt. The adaptation is part of the recovery at the end, because once you've usually recovered, you've hopefully remodeled tissue to accommodate that. Well, the problem we run into is that when the stress becomes excessive, and we're not talking about overtraining, guys, because overtraining is a chronic situation. Overtraining is a condition your body reaches when you've just pushed it so far beyond, repeatedly beyond what it can handle, that it can just no longer recover it anyway. And an actual overtraining is a term that gets thrown around too lightly online. People try to spin it as a positive thing. Oftentimes overtraining requires hospitalization. So when people say, oh, I overtrained, it's like, well, what'd your doctor say about it? You mean you were up walking and doing a normal job after overtraining? I don't think you experienced overtraining, because you're going to have to miss work and everything. Like, you're not going to have a normal life if you've reached an overtrained condition. You're not still going to be having sex with your girlfriend. You're not going to be hanging out with your bro standing up. You're not going to be going to your job. You're going to be in bed. That's where you're going to be if you've actually overtrained. You may be in a hospital bed with machines hooked up to you. So, back to the point. The problem we run into, though, is that it takes time to recover. And if your recovery window starts to exceed your adaptation window, and in this case, we know that people who are not on drugs, that muscle protein synthesis uptime only lasts anywhere from about 28 up to about 48 hours. Well, the time you're spending in recovery from your training load, right? The time you're spending in recovery is cutting into your adaptation time. In other words, if it takes you 48 hours to recover from a training session at the muscular level, we're not talking about the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, we're talking about the tissue itself. If you are still recovering after 48 hours from a training session because you've destroyed your chest, you're not going to grow from it. I'm going to state that again. If it takes you so long to recover at the muscular level from a training session because you destroyed a muscle that you exceed the muscle protein synthesis uptime window, you do not get a positive adaptation. You don't make any gains from it. This is the problem we have with coming in and people saying, oh, I just destroyed this body part? Well, you probably did stimulate a lot of growth. I mean, seriously, you probably did. If you came in and you took 10 sets close to failure, 15 sets close to failure, yeah, you probably did destroy that body part. But what you need to make sure is that, was it within your recovery window? In other words, at the tissue level, you probably want to be recovered within about 24 hours. In other words, you do not want to stimulate a muscle and damage it to the point to where it cannot recover within about 24 hours. Because if you do, it's probably not going to see significant growth. And this is why breaking things up, because it's not just about that muscle protein synthesis time, because you're not going to grow 7 days a week. We can say things like that, oh yeah, you just stay growing all the time with enough frequency. No, you don't, because you're not growing during that initial, some of that early tissue recovery. You're not. So while you're in part of the recovery process, you're not actually growing. So it is an issue of creating enough training stress to cause an adaptation to where you need to adapt, but you need to recover in time to be able to adapt. Now, drugs extend all these windows out, and it becomes a totally different animal once enough drugs come into the mix. Or people who aren't blasting a bunch of drugs, you're using very modest amounts, or most of you, nothing at all, this is an issue. Now, the problem we run into is, how do we work around this as we get more advanced? Because this is why you start to see staggered training. This is why things like concurrent periodization, this is things like why heavy, medium, light days exist for more and more advanced lifters, is not because they're trying to stimulate enough adaptation every workout. It's that what they are trying to do at a certain threshold is that those heavy workouts are the only ones they're actually stimulating adaptation in. Meaning, let's say that you need X amount of volume in a training session to stimulate growth, right? You need X amount of volume, but that volume is so high that you can't fully recover from it. Now, you don't need to do that in your first couple years training, but more advanced lifters, what ends up happening, their maximum recoverable volume starts to get very, very close to their minimum effective dose to stimulate new growth. So what ends up happening with them, very frequently, they need to actually do like one session a week to where they do exceed their ability to recover. And they make almost no gains from that session. But what ends up happening is that they reinforce it with a lighter workout. So let's say you've done X amount of volume over here, and you've exceeded your ability to recover. And then you come in and you do a lighter one 2 days later, or 3 days later with the same muscle groups or same lifts, where you don't do as much tonnage. You don't actually do enough training to stimulate an adaptation, but what do? You re-spark some muscle protein synthesis to feed the previous workout, to get yourself stimulated again to start growing as a result of it. You're just re-sparking some muscle protein synthesis and reinforcing the movement patterns and the stimulation of the first workout that was really kind of excessive, that you couldn't fully recover from. And then you'll come in and maybe do, again, a more medium workout a couple days later, again, so on a heavy, medium, light system. This is what a lot of more intermediate and advanced natural lifters have to do to ensure adaptation. And it's because their stress recovery adaptation cycle gets more skewed as it becomes harder to stimulate more growth. And that's kind of why we have natural limits. It's really more of a recovery issue. Like when you tell people, look, you're only going to be able to get so big as a natural, it's not even all about just frame and everything. That's a big part of it. It's not only about just how big a muscle fiber will get without drugs. It is having to deal with that stress recovery adaptation cycle and having to try to put enough training stress on the body to make it grow, but then recover in enough time to actually adapt to it. It starts to get harder because the bigger you get, the more training stress that you need to stimulate further adaptation. And recovery can't always keep pace at normal hormone levels. And so that's why you start seeing more staggered training. This is why you see heavy, medium, light systems. This is why you see things like concurrent periodization. This is why you see this stuff more and more for more advanced lifters, of why they need it. Because the stuff that works for the novice, if you just you train just enough to grow, you recover from it, adapt to it, and do it again 2 days later, right? You can squat 3 days a week easy. You can squat near maximum weight with moderate volume is a perfect example. Is in your first year of lifting, and you will grow every single session. You'll be growing all the time from it. As you get more advanced, it becomes more complicated. And so you really have to pay a lot more attention to this whole stress recovery adaptation cycle. But it's the same thing for the novice lifter. The novice lifter, once they've built enough work capacity after their first few months, they will be able to exceed the training loads that they can recover from in time to actually adapt to it. And so they can fall victim to the problems with the stress recovery adaptation cycle also. And again, as I always say, you're better spacing that volume out most of the time, especially if you're natural, and especially if you don't have a massive work capacity yet. You're better off spacing that volume out through the week. You're a lot better off. And when you get very advanced, sometimes you have to start staggering these things to break through plateaus. But for most of you out there, it's not something I would worry about. Like if you're only squatting 315 for a couple reps, I wouldn't worry about that sort of stuff yet. You're probably still fine. But as you get more and more advanced, it does need to get more complicated to continue to deal with that. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.